Hey listener, I promise this isn't fake news. This episode will answer the question, what is real wine? Or at least, what real wine means to the executive wine editor of Food and Wine magazine. Ray Isle will explain the difference between mass-produced, inexpensive wines you might find on the bottom shelf at a supermarket, and real wines made by real people with real stories using authentic and responsible methods. It's possible that in the next half hour, your entire perception of wine will be completely changed. This is the Inside Wine Podcast. I'm Joe Janish, a certified specialist of wine and wine industry professional since 1996, giving you insider tips to make the right wine decisions. And today our guest is Ray Isle, the executive wine editor of Food and Wine magazine. And what we want to talk about today is his new book, The World in a Wineglass, The Insider's Guide to Artisanal, Sustainable, Extraordinary Wines to Drink Now. So Ray, thank you so much for joining us today on the Inside Wine Podcast.
Thanks, Joe. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So Ray, I've been in the wine business for over 25 years, getting close to 30 years now. And I've read just about every book about wine that needs to be read. And so when I found out that you were coming out with a book, I was like, well, this is great. I love Ray's writing. I love everything that Ray's done in the wine business and as the food and wine editor through the years. And I'm going to get this book, even though I'm probably not even going to read it. I'm probably not going to even look at it because it's Ray and I want to support him. And he's done a great thing for the wine industry and for the wine consumer. And then I started reading it and I said, oh my God, this is one of the best books about wine that I've read maybe in my lifetime. And it's a book that I think everyone should read. So congratulations to you, Ray. It's tremendous.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I do agree that as someone in the wine business, usually the last thing you want to read is a book about wine. It's
exactly.
Like, and I dutifully do read the books that come through, and we occasionally review things. But it's high praise from someone in the wine business to say they actually read your book and liked it. It's all too often they just go on a shelf and kind of sit there looking pretty. So,
well, exactly. And, the nice thing about this book is that what resonated with me is something that I've thought about throughout my career in the wine business. I've always worked with wine importers and with really great wine producers from around the world. And when I try to talk to the average common consumer about wine, I kind of have a hard time because when people think about wine, and you said this in your book, that, wine just people just think about wine as a beverage. They don't really think about it as much beyond that. And this book really kind of like digs into that and kind of explains the difference between, the common wine that most people are familiar with and what you call real wine. So maybe you could just start to talk a little bit about what real wine is to you.
Yeah. So, it's funny. The original working title for the book was Real Wine, which the publisher felt was a little opaque and that it would probably be obvious to the trade, but not to people out there who are just kind of generally into wine. And that's a lot of who I wanted to reach with the book is, folks who are just getting interested in wine or people who were like me when I got into the business, or before I got into this, when I got into wine in the first place. But what I mean by real wine versus, and it's not to say that, mass market sort of mass produced wine is unpleasant. It can be perfectly tasty. It's just that I think that when you've got a wine that is, farmed conventionally with agrochemicals and it's made in, 100,000 gallon tanks and it's, fits to a marketing profile, that's a very different thing from a wine that's made by a person who actually lives on their land and farms in a way that is, environmentally conscientious in some context and is trying to make wines that really express both the place they're from and a vision. And there are perfectly tasty wines out there on store shelves that are made in huge quantities and don't have that kind of personal or place expression. But I think if you get into wine, wine isn't just about taste. You gain something from drinking a wine that really is a kind of a artisanal product that comes from a place, and you kind of associate the soil and the land with what you're drinking, and you associate the person who made it. It's a little, one analogy I've used, this is a little like shopping, for produce at the farmer's market, where you're buying something from the person who actually grew it and how they grew it and what you're putting in your body versus, buying frozen spinach in the supermarket, which came from some giant, who knows where. So,
right.
So the spinach factories of wherever, and That's not to say that frozen spinach isn't handy, but it's a different experience, and a different kind of way of looking at agriculture. And I think of wine as an agricultural product at its best. It is both an alcoholic beverage, but it is something that comes from the land.
Right. And you started to play into one of the things that I read in your book. I can't remember which winemaker had said it to you, but the quote was, you go down the whole food aisles, people are throwing organic into the shopping cart. They're looking at the ingredients, they're looking at the foods. And then when it comes to the wine, it's just like, what the hell? Like, they're just whatever.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. It was Mark Neal at Neal Family Vineyards in Napa. It's one of my favorite quotes in the book, and it's so true. Though I think one of the reasons for the book is that I think it's changing. I think wine trends that echo food trends tend to kind of follow after them. I think because everybody eats food and not everybody drinks wine, and so there's been a lot of interest in the food world about where do things come from, how are they grown, what am I putting in my body, is this organic, is it not, and for a long time in wine, that really wasn't a consideration, or was a consideration only for a very few people. But I think that's changing. And I think as you talk to younger and younger consumers, you see it's really something they care about quite a bit. I mean, as you know, being in the business, it's wine is weird in that it's not, it's regulated by a different agency than food is. Food is FDA, wine is TTB. Or whatever, because it's a vice.
Right.
It's. It used to be alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. But I guess we lost firearms somewhere along the way, and they just stopped regulating it completely. But it's. So there's no labeling rules about wine. So it's kind of up to the winery to be transparent about what's in the bottle.
Yeah, exactly. And again, like the whole organic thing, like for so many years, as you know, people in the wine business kind of shied away from the whole organic thing because the average consumer back in the day thought that the wine would taste different somehow because it said organic on there, but that's obviously not the case. Maybe you could expound on that a little bit for us.
Yeah, it's one of the crucial things that I tried to explain in the book and explain in a way that was fun to read and not just dauntingly technical, is that what is sustainability, what is organics, what is regenerative agriculture, what is biodynamics, and so on. And I think in the past there was a sense that quote unquote organic wine was funky and weird and made by like unwashed hippies somewhere in the 1960s, and it's really not the case anymore. That wine growers, at least grape growers for wine, are very ahead of the game in terms of farming organically or sustainably. That there's a lot of impetus towards that, particularly in Europe. And one of the other quotes in the book I love, and I can't remember who said it off the top of my head because the book is long, but it's organics or biodynamics is not a flavor. It's an approach to farming, and it's a sensibility about how you're going to treat the earth, but it doesn't translate in the glass to a specific flavor. It doesn't taste like funky or not funky or anything. It's really about how you grow the grapes. It gets a little more complicated when you get into government certifications and the winemaking side, but really with grapes, it's a question of how you're going to treat the land and what you're going to spray or not spray on your grapes. And that's kind of the heart of the book in a lot of ways, is, looking at how people farm the vines that they're making wine from, and that it really is a philosophical choice and an agricultural choice rather than a flavored choice, I guess is the way you'd say it.
Right. And just to be clear for people who haven't picked up the book yet, it's not necessarily a book about just organic wines, and it's not necessarily just a book about sustainable wines. Tell us how you kind of came to the decision of the wine. I know you wrote about it in the book, but people listening probably haven't read it yet. So why don't you give us a little thing? Yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to, the first thing was I really wanted to concentrate on, what we talked about earlier, real wines, so wines that, that came from a specific person or family working in a specific place, trying to make great wines that express where they're from. As it happens, most of those people, at least the ones I love, are also tend to be working sustainably, organically, biodynamically, take your pick. So there was an instant overlap when I started thinking about the book, and it sort of made sense to concentrate on those two things. The kind of filters for the book are that I didn't write about anybody that I didn't speak to personally, whether that was in person, in New York in our office doing a tasting, or at their estate or farm or whatever, which, I've been to a lot of the places in the book. And I caveat for Zoom calls during the pandemic, which really messed up my traveling for 2 years. So there's no one in there that I didn't talk to specifically. There's no wine in there that I haven't tasted. And kind of one of the unstated things is actually all the wines in the book have to be good. I didn't write about anything I didn't think was delicious. If you look at it broadly, I mean, Domaine Romanée-Conti would fit into the kind of wines I'm writing about. I mean, it's owned by a family or a pair of families. It makes gorgeous wines that express the place they're from. But the cheapest bottle is like $2,500 a bottle. And there have been thousands of pages written about it over the years. And I just didn't want to concentrate on the one, wines no one could afford, and two, wines that have been written about forever. So there are definitely some familiar names in the book. There are, I hope, some names that will really inspire people to seek out their wines. But most of the wines in the book are in the sort of $20 to $40 range a bottle, going up to $100. There's very little over $100 because I really wanted to concentrate on wines you can actually go out and buy and not like go into cardiac arrest when you pay for them. And I said somewhere in the introduction to the book, you can live your entire life drinking wines under $100 and have an utterly astonishing life of drinking wine. And it's true. There are brilliant wines out there that don't cost $500 a bottle or $1,000 a bottle. And it's fun to kind of window shop for the super high end ones. But unless you're, a captain of industry or a tech baron or whatever, you don't spend $1,000 a bottle on a daily basis. At least I don't. I mean, maybe you do, but I certainly don't.
Not me. I'm in the wine business. I don't make a lot of money.
Yeah. The virtue of the wine business or writing or the wine journalism business, you get to taste wines occasionally that you couldn't conceivably afford, but you're not the guy who's buying them.
Correct. Yeah. And that's one of the things I really enjoyed about this book and why I'm going to be recommending it to, a lot of friends who are, not in the wine business, who are the average wine consumer and they just want to pick up a good bottle of wine. What's really nice about the book is that the wines that you suggest are accessible. They're not the really expensive ones. And the book is not overly technical whatsoever. You've got a nice glossary in the back, which was great.
It's a somewhat opinionated glossary, but it was fun to write,
Yeah, but it's fun to read. Like it's fun to read a glossary that has some, little bit of tongue in cheek in there in a little bit. It's a lot of fun. It's probably the most fun glossary you'll read. So going a little further into that. So what you also mentioned in the book was that if you're really into wine and you're buying what Ray is selling in this book, you should be a collector, but not the kind of collector that most people think about. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah. The typical idea of a wine collector is someone with a lot of money who stores up, thousands of bottles of wine, and then eventually that auctions them off when they realize they've got too much to ever drink again.
Right.
And it's about money, and it's that very often male urge to collect things, and there's a little bit of a show off aspect to it. And that's not what I suggest. Sort of is in terms of being a collector is more about being a collector of different experiences of wine, of different tastes of wine, so that you create a kind of library in your mind about what all these different wines taste like and what the experiences you've had with them, and so you're a collector in an experiential sense rather than in a hoarding kind of sense. You're not Smog the dragon sitting on your hoard of gold, but you're sort of traversing the world, whether it's from an armchair or actually by traveling, in the context of wine. And that's important to me because I got into wine not from a wine back. I mean, in my family, there was no wine floating around the table or anything like that. And I fell in love with it unexpectedly. And then eventually it became my career, writing and wine together. But, as a result, I still have endless curiosity about it. And I'm always hunting for new bottles or new experiences. And I think that's the real side of being a collector. It's like, it's the cellar you've got is your brain, not so much your vault under your castle. Right.
Yeah, that is the fun of wine. The fun of wine is discovering new things and experiencing them in different ways, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, I do point out, that early in the book that wine is, as a shopping experience is completely insane. You walk into Total Wine and there's, 600 different Chardonnays, and it's just complete lunacy that this is how something is sold. At the same time, when you're getting interested in wine, it's really fun to go to a wine store and just see all these possibilities in front of you. I mean, this is what I remember from, I sort of started getting into wine when I was in grad school studying literature, and you go into the store. In my case, it was K&L in California, and you look around and you'd be like, oh, there's all these old vine Zinfandels, and I've never had an old vine Zinfandel. I've never had any of these old vine Zinfandels, and I was very fortunate that one of my key pieces of advice for people getting into wine is find a good store with people who actually care about wine who will talk to you. And the guys at K&L, even with my like $19 a week budget being a grad student for buying wine, they would take time to ask me what I got last time and suggest things that might be good. And it was a great education, and it was a great, I guess the way to put it is like a great introduction to wine. It's exciting to have yourself fall for wine. So it's really cool. It's intellectually interesting and hedonistically pleasurable. It's not like falling for trigonometry or something.
A little more fun than trigonometry for most people.
And that's not to offend all the math students out there who love trigonometry, but for me, it was not fun. I derived no joy from trigonometry.
Yeah, correct. You just reminded me of something in the book that made me laugh when you were talking about all the different Chardonnays that you'll find in a total wine shop. And you compared it to if somebody walked into a grocery store and saw like 700 different types of soup, right?
Yeah, of the chicken soup, and there, this is an analogy I made, and I've used that in classes before, and it's like, yeah, it's insane. It's like you walk in and there's 700 kinds of soup, and it's 700 different brands of soup, and some of them are single chicken soups, and some of them are chicken soups from a certain terroir, and some get 98 points, and some get 70 points, and some cost $2.99, and some cans of chicken soup are $85, and you'd be like, this is completely insane. I'm never buying chicken soup again in my life. Get me the hell out of here.
Exactly.
And that's wine. I mean, that's a lot of consumers' experiences of wine, and I hope to kind of make people have a little less of that, choice stress in their life.
Yeah, and you talked about this in the book, and that exact reason is why people have moved toward looking at the numbers, the reviews, the scores from the wine spectators. But like, what's a better way to do this?
Well, I don't. I wish I had the answer. I don't know. I mean, I do think scores are reductive and kind of assume an objectivity that isn't actually the case. I mean, aesthetic judgments are subjective within some kind of cultural framework that says what's good and what's bad. And I made I can't even remember if I used this in the book, but if I look at my daughter's drawing of a horse when she was 6, to me, that's a great piece of art. Now I'm cognizant it's not the Mona Lisa. I mean, right. I'm not an idiot. But every critic is critiquing within a kind of framework of accepted value. That said, wine scores tend to just pretend to complete objectivity, and this wine is 92 and I'm right. And that's just weird, especially for something that changes in the bottle and something that involves taste, which is an incredibly, subjective thing. It does simplify a really complicated marketplace, and that is why scores have been so effective. But I think from my point of view, they're reductive as well, which is a pity, because I'm much more interested in the people behind the wine and the place it comes from and the thought that went into it and how you can experience that by tasting a sip of the wine.
Right. And again, like following on that, there was another example in your book, and I've heard it 1,000 times too. A friend goes off to Italy, with their loved one, and right. And they go to this nice little place, and a nice cucina or something, and have this amazing bottle of Chianti, and they write it down, and they get home and they find that Chianti, and they open it up in their dining room, and they're like, this isn't the wine that I had in Italy, right?
Yeah, this is not the same wine. They must like, I don't know, maybe they put more sulfites in when they ship it to the U.S. and it's like, no, that's sorry, it is exactly the same wine. You, however, are different. You are not on vacation in Italy and elated to be there. You're just tired after a day of work, and so the contextual aspect of wine is huge. We all have this experience. You remember wines. The wines you remember best tend not to be like a sip out of a tiny pour at a tasting somewhere. It tends to be a wine that you had with someone you loved or people you really enjoyed being with, friends, in a context that often involves great food. I mean, those are the wines that stick with you. And that's kind of supersedes the question of whether it had 92 points or 91 points or 87 points or whatever.
Right. Right. So, let's say the average wine consumer who's into wine wants to, do a little better with their wine selections for themselves, discover more wines and become that collector that you're talking about. Now, you mentioned one thing you could do is find a retail shop where they talk to you. Some people are a little shy about that. They're a little intimidated. I think that this book will help arm them a little bit, but maybe you could give us some more tips on how people can get over this.
Absolutely. I hope the book helps people out. It's what it's meant to do. And it's meant to be, it's meant to be fun to read, not dry and technical.
And it is absolutely.
Partly because it's full of stories. And then,
Yeah.
My career in wine was partly spurred by basically one thing that happened to me early on as I went into a wine store and wanted to buy a Cabernet. I was still trying to figure out what Cabernet was, and asked for something that wasn't too tannic. And I remember the guy looking at me like, "You're such an idiot." And I thought, man, I'm never going to treat someone like that in any context in wine if I ever even end up in wine. And it pissed me off so much that it's been a guiding force in my entire wine career is to not talk down to people and not be a snob. Because one, it's rude. Two, it's a huge problem with wine that wine is seen as pretentious, and it's fermented grape juice on a baseline level, and it's been drunk by everyone from peasants to kings straight through history. So it's not innately pretentious. We just unfortunately it falls into that. But I think there's so much information on the internet right now about wine that's a very different. There's very different access to information than there used to be when I first got into wine, which is great. There's a lot of misinformation and mistaken stuff. But for instance, Food and Wine, where I write for, all of our stuff is not paywalled and it's out there for people to check out. I do think wine books are. I'm a big fan of books. Obviously, I just published one. I think there are a lot of great wine books out there that helped inform my wine buying over time. Some straightforward, like, Karen McNeil's Wine Bible is a great intro book to wine. Some are more narrative, like Adventures on the Wine Route by Kermit Lynch is a wonderful book about wine that gets into the experience of traveling and visiting wineries when he was a young importer. All of that stuff kind of is I think incredibly valuable. Now that you have Kindles, you can just download them. My book is intended to help people. It's not just to convert them to organics or something like that. It's really about finding great wines that you really, really love drinking. And I think that you don't have to do WSET training or sommelier training or whatever to learn more about wine. But if you get the opportunity to go to wine tastings or take a wine class, wine 101 class or anything, I just always say, taste as much as you possibly can, and don't taste the stuff that you already know you like. Taste as much as you can that you don't know you like, because that's the best way to learn. You like Cabernet from Napa Valley. Well, like, go to a Spanish wine tasting just to see what's going on. And a lot of good stores do tastings, depending on the state and the regulations,
right.
Because our wine world is completely insane.
Yep.
But I used to go, K&L, because it's California, used to have tastings. They used to just have like 15 bottles lined up, and you paid like $1 or $2, depending on the bottle, to taste and ounce. And I would go through and just taste to see what there was out there. And that's really, you don't have to be in wine country to do that. And it's enormously helpful, I think.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing, and something that, really I like to recommend that you just kind of touched on is that, there are a lot of people who are like, well, I'm a white wine person, or I'm a red wine person, or I only like Chardonnay. And that's kind of like the whole reason to try and taste some other things, like, right? Otherwise, if you did that with food, you'd only be eating like chicken nuggets for the rest of your life.
Yeah, well, it's exactly like food. It's literally, if you said I'm a chicken nugget person and that was all you ate for the rest of your life. If that's really who you are, then fine. It's not like I expect to convert you to liver anytime soon, but it's a pretty limited way of living your food life. And I think wine's kind of similar. It's like, you can say, yes, fine. If you prefer white wines, great. Like, drink white wines all the time. But there's a lot of white wine out there, and you may not know if you like Gruner Veltliner or Albarino. And the thing about learning about wine is, not to beat on trigonometry, but learning about wine is fun because you get to drink wine while you learn about wine. It's not a really heavy technical kind of pursuit. It's the knowledge the learning is combined with the hedonistic pleasure of drinking wine. It's also more fun to do with someone else. If you've got a group of friends and you could all buy one bottle of something and bring it over and try different things, you amortize the cost among everybody, and you don't have to have a fancy meal. You just buy a bunch of potato chips and try a bunch of different wines. Potato chips work great with wine, obviously.
Yeah. Potato chips and champagne, one of the best matches there is.
Absolutely. It's a classic.
Yeah. So there was something in the book that really made me laugh because I totally connect with you on this one. the younger generation that's getting into wine, and you touched on this a little bit, where how wine can be very snobby and people can, put on airs and whatever. And I feel like that started to happen with things like orange wine and natural wine and that sort of thing.
Yeah. It's a different form of snobbery from the old school form. I mean, the old school wine snobbery was very elite, and
Yes.
this is more the snobbery of the kind of indie music scene, where if you don't like the right band, you're totally uncool. And it's one of the problems I have. I mean, there are a lot of natural wines that I love. I'm a little mixed about the world of natural wine, which does have a kind of exclusionary cool to it. And that bothers me because wine should be inclusionary. And the other thing is that, one of the reasons I wrote the book too was to kind of break down this, to my mind, artificial barrier between natural wine and all these producers who are, let's say, working biodynamically and not really using so much sulfur and expressing, working to create wines of place and basically being non-interventionist, but somehow do not fit into the natural wine camp. And so, like, why is there this ridiculous wall between these two worlds when the real division to me is between all of that and the mass produced corporate generic supermarket bottom shelf whatever $5 a bottle juice that's a beverage product rather than an expression of place. And that part of natural wine bothers me. What I do like about natural wine, and this is coming from someone who was basically a punk and indie music listening, cooler than that person during college. And it's like, yeah, I do like the irreverence, and I do like the screw you attitude, and the kind of like, you want to try and define natural wine, well, the hell with you, I'm going to do whatever you say it's not, thing, which, wine can be a little hidebound, and you need something to come in and shake it up. And natural wine has undoubtedly shaken up the wine world. You can tell partly because it's a very, very, very small percentage of the U.S. wine market is natural wine, but the amount of attention and the amount of kind of controversy and the amount of provoking of thought that it's caused is really big, and that's, to me, a kind of telltale that it's, there's something really legit going on there that's worth looking at. And then, like I said, I mean, the simplest natural wine definition is, nothing added, nothing taken away. But the idea is essentially you're a non-interventionist pre-industrial form of winemaking. Some of them are fantastic, and some are, as they often get criticized as being, are so funky and weird that they're, to my mind, not really expressive of anything other than messed upness. But you can't assign that to the entire category. It's kind of, if you look at the entire category of wines that aren't natural wines, then there are some that are great, there's some that are garbage. It's the exact same thing. And people are a little too ready to condemn natural wine in that regard. I mean, if you taste something like, some of the wines from Damien Deschanel at La Grange Tefane, for instance, those are absolutely brilliant wines. And yes, they fall into the natural wine camp, but who cares? They're just brilliant wines in and of themselves.
Right. And I think that's the key. Like, number one, there really isn't any true universal definition of natural wine.
No.
And really there isn't a good hard definition of organic wine, because there are so many different bodies and whatever, which you get into in the book as well.
Yeah. I mean, the problem with organic is that the organic viticulture is actually relatively well defined. Organic winemaking is kind of largely due to sulfite questions of how you define the amount of allowable sulfites. The U.S. regulations are very, very different from EU. I mean, the sulfite thing is problematic anyway, because people's assumptions about what sulfites do and how present they are in wines is largely not informed. They don't cause red wine headaches. They don't, the incidence of sulfite allergies is actually fairly low. The U.S., for USDA certification, you are allowed 10 parts per million added sulfites. For EU certification for organic wine, you're allowed 100 parts per million, or I think it's slightly different between white and red. And there's too much attention paid to that in my mind. And weirdly, like, the sulfite thing goes back to the sulfite labeling in the U.S. goes back to Strom Thurmond, of all people,
Oh, wow.
in North Carolina, the very unpleasant senator from I think he was North Carolina, might have been South Carolina, but he was doing some kind of weird. He was trying to protect something local and resulted in wine or he's trying to get people not to drink. And so he forced through in Congress labeling about sulfites. It's all very bizarre if you go into the history of it. But anyway, the net is that to certify wine as organic, the wine itself, the rules are very different from country to country. To certify the grape growing as organic is much more consistent. And what I tend to tell people is your main concern is like, what was the agriculture? How were the grapes grown? That's really where you run the incidence of much more sort of chemical input, to my mind.
Yeah, agreed. And most of the smaller producers, they don't really have the time or the money to pay for all these different certifications and keep up with all of them, with all the different around the world.
Yeah. And within natural wine, there's also a fair contingent who are just like, I hate certification straight out. I don't want the government to certify me, and which is fair. If you're an irreverent, FU kind of winemaker, why would you want to get French government certification on your wines?
Exactly.
So it's it's interesting. That whole battle is fascinating.
Yeah. So without giving away too much that's in the book, one of the ways I think that you can help the average consumer kind of explore a little more is to kind of give them some guidance on how to taste wine and drink wine. And you took an entire chapter in that. Do you want to just give us like the overview on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a little weird in a wine book to have a chapter on how to drink wine, because as I said at the start of the chapter, that's very straightforward. You pick it up the glass, you put it in put it to your lips, and you swallow the wine. We all got that down. But I wanted people to kind of think about flavor and so on, and about how a wine is more than just a series of adjectives about flavor. It's you can say it tastes like blueberries and blackberries and damson plums and whatever, but that kind of assembly of adjectives honestly doesn't tell you that much about how it tastes. Our minds don't really process lengthy strings of adjectives into something we can understand as a flavor. And I think that, to me, like, let's take a random story out of the book, Etienne Guigal at Guigal, which is a widely distributed wine. His mother basically told him to leave home at age 8. This is between the wars in France, because their father was dead. There was no money. There was no way to support the family. There's no way to eat. She said, basically, you're the smartest. You're the one who's most likely to be able to handle things on your own. This kid is 8. So, she chucked him out of the house. He went and became a shepherd for a little while and worked barefoot in the snow in eastern Loire, and then came over to the Rhone because his brother was picking fruit there, and he was picking fruit in the Rhone, and he looked up and at one point saw the La Mouline vineyard on a hill, which is now one of the great Côte d'Arons of the world. One of the greatest wines in the world. And he said, he asked his brother, what is that? His brother said, it's a vineyard. Don't get involved. They're stupid. They make no money. It's better to pick fruit. And he said, I'm going to buy that one day. And he proceeded to he got into wine. He became the director of De La Frere, I think. I'm trying to remember which of the wineries he became director of. And then he left post-war to start his own winery at Guigal, and he bought La Mouline. He bought additionally the estate and manor house where they are now based, which is where he met his wife when she was a maid working there, I believe, is the story. And it's just this incredible story of both rags to riches, but also willpower and passion about wine. And to my mind, you can't pick up a glass of a Guigal Côte Rôtie or even a Guigal Gros Hermitage. If you know that story, it affects the way you taste the wine. It plays into the perception of the wine, and it deepens it. You don't have to have every wine be that way, but it's fascinating. And that's when I talk about sort of how to drink wine. I'd much rather know that than know that the wine got 96 points and it has fierce acidity and gripping tannins and tastes like a blackberry. It's like, I don't give a shit about that so much. And I've committed, and I've certainly, I do give some descriptors in the book, and I certainly do when I write in Food and Wine, but there's so much more to it that I think is more interesting and more important. And it's the people in the place. And so that's what I talk about when it's like how to drink wine. It's, you could, yes. The analogy I use, and I think this may have come from Dottie and John at the Wall Street Journal way back when, but I don't know where I got it from. But baseball or football, take your pick, is a great analogy. Like football, if you know that the point of the game of football is to take the ball and run it across the goal line, you can go to a football game and basically have an okay time. And that's sort of like knowing that wine is made from grapes and Cabernet is a grape and it tastes good. And that's fine. That's totally cool. If you know what a halfback does and what how they call plays, that's a little bit deeper information, and it does inform the way you watch the game because you know what the players are doing and why they're doing what they're doing. And you'll still have fun at the game. It'll be a different kind of fun. And if you know, like every team's record, wins loss record going back 50 years, and every single player's, stats, and you know how you can identify a play as it's called. That's being a total wine geek, basically. It's the sports equivalent of being, a master somm. But you don't have to have that to love wine or to love football. I think that middle point is a great one where some of the stories and some of what informs the wine and some details, and that gives you a greater appreciation. It really literally makes it more fun, I think, is part of it. Wine should be fun. So it's fermented grape juice and it tastes amazing. And so it should be fun. It shouldn't be daunting and depressing.
I should hope not. Not depressing.
You'll put me on record as saying wine should not be daunting and depressing. How is that?
I'll bring that to the next marketing meeting.
Yeah, there you go. Guys, stop with the daunting and depressing.
That's a great analogy. I think that really that's something that I'm definitely going to use myself when I talk to friends. Be like, when you're learning about a sport, football, baseball, whatever it is, it's doing all that learning and knowing more and more about the sport makes it all the more interesting. And it's the same thing with wine. As long as you take a look at wine as it's not simply a beverage or just something to shove down your gullet. It's like something that can have that kind of higher level of enjoyment.
Yeah. But it's worth doing because you're spending money on it anyway. You might as well learn something about it. I think it's honestly kind of natural because if you get interested in wine, you'll automatically want to know more about it. And if you don't get interested in wine, that's fine. Not everybody has to be interested in wine. Not everybody has to be interested in football. Not everybody has to be interested in anything. Take your pick.
Right. So you mentioned earlier that it was grad school when you started to get into wine. Yeah,
it was.
Do you remember what the wine was that kind of set it off?
Oh yeah, very clearly. It was the wine that like the light bulb going off or the switch being flipped or whatever was a 1984 Diamond Creek Volcanic Hill Vineyard Cabernet Sauvignon from Napa Valley, and I was at a dinner with my girlfriend at the time and her father, and he had been to Napa, and it's 84, I think I said, and this was probably 6 years later, like 1990, and he bought the bottle and I took a couple of sips. I was like, "Oh, this is really good." Took another couple of sips. Like, what the fuck? And then the rest of the dinner. I remember very vividly getting to the end of that glass and one being kind of amazed by that wine, and two wishing that there were more, which is a classic thing. You're like, you get to the last sip, you're like, damn. And what I do not remember is talking to either of them at that dinner, which may be one sign why the relationship didn't last. But the wine just absorbed me completely, and I from that point I started, instead of just buying whatever bottle randomly to bring home for dinner, I started actually getting interested, and I bought like the Hugh Johnson, pocket guidebook, like God knows how many other people in wine, and I started hunting in stores for things to try, and it just completely was a light bulb going off about how good wine could be. And it's like, it was such a good bottle of wine.
Yeah. And I feel like people kind of need to have that light bulb, that aha moment or whatever you want to call it, where it just flips.
Yeah. And it doesn't, that was a wine that at the time was, it's an expensive wine now, but and Diamond Creek was always relatively expensive, but it wasn't, it was, probably retail was probably like a $30 bottle of wine, but that light bulb going off wine doesn't have to be a mega expensive bottle of wine. It's really, again, kind of context and your brain being ready for that moment of, oh my God, this is so amazing.
Do you think that can happen for a $15 bottle?
I think it can in the right context, for sure. And I think there's some very good, there's overperforming $15 bottles, but if you get, a really terrific Côte d'Aron and you're in the right place at the right time, I think it could change your approach to wine, for sure. Especially if you don't have that much familiarity with wine. It's a little tricky if you've been unconsciously drinking $100 bottles of wine because your grandfather has a cellar, or something like that. Then
yeah,
it may not be a $15 bottle that flips the switch, but who knows? Everybody is different.
Absolutely. Again, I think this book is tremendous for anyone, even for those hedge fund owners who have, millions and millions to spend. This is still a really good book to take a look at and give you kind of like a guide toward where you should start, right? Like there are so many great stories in here, like the stories that you just told in the last 35, 40 minutes. The book's full of great stories. It's got great guidance in the beginning. The first few chapters, I'm like, I've reread two of the chapters already from the beginning because
wow, thank you.
Yeah, it just really lays the groundwork for helping someone really, learn the whole adventure of what wine could be.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. That's really what I was hoping to do. So it's very gratifying that is how it comes off. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, definitely does. Any other tips that you want to share without giving away the whole book?
No, I mean, I think, the one thing I would say is, it's not a short book, but it doesn't have to be read linearly. You can dip in and out of it because there's so many, barring the front section, which is about 50, 60 pages of kind of why this book exists and what matters about these wines. It's short profiles of a lot of different wineries around the world, everywhere. Everywhere from famous places like Bordeaux and Burgundy and Napa to very obscure places like Georgia or the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. And you don't have to, there's no linearity to it. So you can just pick it up, read for 10 minutes, read a couple of profiles, move on to whatever's next in the day. Or if you're like headed to Italy, pick up the section on Italy, read the section on Italy because you may want to visit somewhere. So it's long, but it's not a chore. And there's so many quotes and so many stories in there that I was kind of blown away by as I did the research. I think it would be fun for anybody. That's my sense. I hope people will let me know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it is a lot of fun. And thank you for also reminding me that it is like I have two children right now. They're 6 and 7, so I don't have a whole lot of time to read. Yeah. But I did pick up this book and I got it on my Kindle, and just like you said, and I'm going through it little by little, piece by piece, and it, I can pick it up anywhere and enjoy, 10 minutes of reading or 15 minutes of reading or 3 minutes of reading or whatever it is. So it's and I don't know how big it is because it's on my Kindle, so that makes it easier.
Right, that's nice. It's infinitely long on the Kindle, or as short as you want it to be,
Yeah,
yeah. It's about 700 pages hardback, but that's like I said, it's also not insanely small font, so it's actually readable, which is nice.
Yeah. So hopefully we can get this episode out before Christmas, and if you're hearing this before Christmas, please, listener, go out and get it for the wine lover in your life. Get one for yourself. If you're listening to this after Christmas, there's no reason why you can't buy it anyway. It's a great book.
Yeah, that's right. There's a lot of downtime after Christmas. Good for reading books.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. Thank you so much. Really appreciate this. And good luck with the book. Yeah.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you very much for having me on. This is a lot of fun.
Thanks so much for listening to my conversation with Ray Isle. We hope this episode will help you look at wine buying and wine drinking in a slightly different way. And maybe you'll buy Ray's new book, The World in a Wineglass, The Insider's Guide to Artisanal, Sustainable, Extraordinary Wines to Drink Now. It's available on Amazon and everywhere books are sold. There's a link in the show notes. I have it on my Kindle and already highlighted dozens of excerpts, and I sincerely believe you'll both enjoy reading it and believe it'll help guide you toward becoming a different kind of wine collector. Until next time, please visit wine365.com, and remember, wine is food, it comes from a place, enjoy it responsibly.